This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode, alongside my co-host Bob Pastorella, we chat with masters of horror about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Now, today's guest is Catherine M. Valente. She's the New York Times best-selling author of over 24 works of fiction and poetry, including Palimpsest, the Orphan's Tale series, Defiance, Radiance, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. That's a hell of a title. And her latest releases, The Past is Red and Comfort Me with Apples, both of which we'll be talking about in the second part of this conversation. But for this first part, we have so much. We, of course, talk about Kat's early life lessons growing up. We talk about Eurovision and the popular novel Space Opera. We talk about Pete's Island. We talk about musical performances and collaborations with S.J. Tucker, and much, much more. But before any of that, a little bit of an advert break.
Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.
From the host of This is Horror Podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. They're Watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
Okay, well, with that said, here it is. It is Catherine M. Valente on This is Horror. Kat, welcome to This is Horror.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. To begin with, I want to talk about some of the early life lessons that you learned growing up, and these don't necessarily have to pertain to story or writing, but anything you learned in your formative years.
Oh, anything at all that I learned in my formative years? Gosh, well, presumably I learned a lot. I was a horror fan from way back. My stepmother was like the biggest Stephen King fan you can imagine, so I was quite young stealing her books and reading them. And I remember kind of one of the things that I took from them was that like a proper story is about bad things that happen to children, because that's pretty much what all those books were about, and that all the magic in America is on the East Coast. Which isn't true, but seemed like it at the time because every one of those books is set on the East Coast. It's kind of the natural home of American horror. I don't know. What did I learn as a child? I'm trying not to go dark. That's why I'm hesitant.
Oh, I mean, we're all okay with dark. We've had some pretty bleak openers to these conversations.
Yeah, most people will abandon you. Books are your only friends, that kind of thing. I learned that. Yeah, I had a kind of an odd childhood. My parents were divorced when I was really young, so I would go back and forth between Seattle and California from an early age. So I was traveling on my own a lot, and I mean, I guess like rely on yourself was a big one that I learned because I was kind of all my siblings are half siblings, so I was the only one in my particular situation of having to travel like that, and I did learn to kind of bury myself in books and rely on myself.
Yeah, and I know before that you said in terms of being raised by your stepmother, it was a little bit like Snow White was a documentary of your life. So I wondered
Yeah,
if we
I
could
mean,
talk about
kind
that.
of like if you could see me right now, I look a lot like Snow White. My coloring is very similar. But my stepmother and my siblings, they're all blonde and blue eyed. So I was very much like, the dark haired, dark eyed, weird kid. And because my mother was this who wasn't really involved with a lot of my childhood, so she was this mysterious figure, and there was all the kind of drama that goes with being a child of divorce in the 80s and not always feeling like you're related to anyone. You're might as well run off into the woods and live with a bunch of dwarves. Like you can often look around when you're in that position as a child and just feel like you don't belong anywhere. And I certainly felt like that a lot as a kid. I mean, I think that most writers do feel like they didn't belong. I mean, that's kind of why we create places where we belong.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, in terms of your own creations, when did you first start writing or telling stories?
Oh, I started telling stories as soon as I could talk.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I've quite literally seen video footage of me at 4 years old, and we're hiking around Mount Rainier, and I'm telling my parents a story about the wizard who lives under the mountain, and they're not overly listening to me, but like I clearly was driven to make up stories from the minute I could. I read very early as well, but I didn't. What I wrote was poetry for the most part. I wrote some stories here and there when I was younger, but for the most part, poetry was kind of where my love was until I graduated from college.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds from what you've said, both here and in previous interviews, that your early reading taste was very eclectic. I mean, I know you've said you grew up reading science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and, the distinction between genre was almost something you didn't pay attention to. They were all the same genre in a sense.
It's really true. And I just didn't think about that kind of stuff at all. Like I kind of plowed through bookshelves on my own, powered by my own interests and obsessions. And so I read all kinds of stuff, but like it really didn't genre didn't make any difference to me at all. And that's continued through a lot of my life as I went on to major in classics and, ancient Greek literature doesn't differentiate between what we would consider fantasy and reality at all. Like the Minotaur will show up in reality as far as they're concerned.
Mm.
But when I was younger, like, Gone with the Wind seemed pretty much the same kind of thing as a horror novel to me. And I kind of stand by that idea now. Like there is a certain stance when you're just kind of coming to literature that you can take where you see the relationships between all kinds of stories and the terrible treatment of human beings and the feeling of complicity and just watching a story unfold that probably isn't going to end up happily. It's a very similar feeling when reading an epic horror novel.
Right. Well, I mean, another book that you read early on was Wuthering Heights, and I mean, that can very easily be described as a horror novel too. Goodness.
It sure is. Oh, I think that Emily Bronte totally would have written like a horror serial killer. You could totally see Heathcliff as a serial killer. I read that when I was 13. I read that really early. And I do remember just like the big revelation I took from that was that adults aren't any better at dating or love or romance than me and my friends in 8th grade. So things are just never ever gonna get any better.
Yeah, I guess that kind of realization can be both liberating and also depressing. I mean, at least, there isn't this higher standard that you have to aspire towards, or you don't have to kind of quite realize what you're doing, but then you realize, God damn it, no one knows what they're doing.
But it's good to realize that. It's good to realize that people don't actually know what they're doing. And with something like Wuthering Heights, which is this classic novel, and as a 13-year-old, you hear a classic novel and you invest it with a certain amount of authority. And for, a young American girl, not only is it a classic novel, it's a classic English novel. So it must be full of people who know what the world is all about. And then it's just a bunch of people acting like idiots and jerks and just doing the wrong thing at every possible turn. So it was certainly a revelation for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say that British people have advanced since that point, but, acting like idiots, jerks, and making the wrong move at every turn. Yeah, we kind of have a habit of that.
But one thing that the British Empire did right was manage to invest tons of other cultures with the idea that like British literature is the wisest and greatest thing of all time. So it took me a long time of approaching it that way. Like, well, this one surely will show me human beings at their best. Oh, not so much. Moving on to the next one.
Yeah. Well, I'll take that as a win then, which is more than we can say for our Eurovision record, which is a ridiculous segue into space opera.
I'm sorry about this year. That was hard.
Yeah, but I mean, well, some of the things even the presenters were saying were not really doing much to help our cause, for the matter.
No.
But I mean, I'd planned to talk to you in somewhat chronological order of your career, but as with most of these conversations, it's gone out the window already. Because I want to talk about space opera. It's essentially Eurovision in space. Yep. So the only requirement for so there's different species kind of competing in the Metagalactic Grand Prix in this musical competition. The only requirement is for Earth not to come in last place if it doesn't want to be destroyed. Unfortunately, the representation from Earth is British, and it's Decibel Jones and the Absolute Zeros, a name that perhaps doesn't inspire confidence to win a competition like that. So please tell us how this came about.
It's the most ridiculous story of how a book came to be written ever. It's straight up stupid. So I love Eurovision. I do. I saw it for the first time in 2012 in London. My friend Molly, I was there for a book tour, I think, for Fairyland, for the second Fairyland book. And my friend Molly and her husband Matthew had me over to stay with them while I was there. And they said, but the one requirement is we are having a Eurovision party and you will have to watch it. And I said, and what's that? And then my life changed. I genuinely, unironically, completely fell in love with it. And so I began to live tweet it every year. So a couple of years after that, 2016, I guess it was, I was live tweeting as I usually do. And one of my fans in the Philippines tweeted at me, ha ha ha, you should write a science fiction or fantasy Eurovision. And I tweeted back, ha ha, that'd be fun. And 5 minutes later, literally, actually 5 minutes later, I got a DM in my inbox from an editor at Simon & Schuster saying, I will buy that right now. And my editor, Nava, was every bit the Eurovision fan that I am. And my agent still calls it the fastest deal in publishing. We had a deal in 24 hours. And the contract literally still, to this day, I should frame it, the contract still says Eurovision in space. It doesn't say, there's no title, there's nothing to it at all. And, I had no ideas for it whatsoever. Even as I was signing the contract, my husband was like, do you know what you're going to write? And I was like, mm-mm. It's like, any ideas? It's like, nope, sign my name. Uh, and so when I sat down to write it, I spent about a week coming up with the name Decibel Jones and the Absolute Zeros and a couple of the other band names. And it really was an exercise in that this is my new band name drinking game that people play, songs and bands and things like that. And then I kind of just went off with it. I wrote the first chapter very quickly, and I kind of sat back and thought, well, how comfortable am I with being compared to Douglas Adams? Because that's what's going to happen if I consider with the book as it has come out so far. And to some extent, if you're going to have British people in space, you will be like Douglas Adams is going to come into the conversation one way or another. But I made them British for two reasons. One was that of all of the countries that participate in Eurovision, I have only lived in the UK. And therefore felt like I could write about it with some level of authenticity. I suppose technically I have spent some time in Australia, but I wouldn't say I've lived there. And two, I thought it would be funny because of the whole Neil Point thing. The UK doesn't win Eurovision, so I thought it would be funny to have them save the world. And so ultimately I decided, well, there is something freeing about this. I am not going to sit down today and write the greatest science fiction comedy novel of all time. That's been done. I can shoot for the bronze comfortably. So I ended up writing this book as I wanted to write it, with very little compromise to what I wanted to do. It is a little much. It is a little over the top. It is a little cheesy and ridiculous, but that's Eurovision. It also has some serious things to say, and that's very Eurovision too. It has a bunch of Easter eggs in it. Like every chapter is the name of a song that has been sung in Eurovision. Most of them are not winners. And all of the names of the aliens and the planets and the personal names of the aliens, all of that, they're words from the languages of participating Eurovision countries. So it is a big love letter to Eurovision, and it is also probably the closest thing to a sports movie I'll ever write. And just in some ways it's my love letter to the world too. Just people and the world we can do. Yeah.
And I kind of like this concept of shoot for the bronze because, we hear a lot of people saying, to kind of shoot for the top. And then if you failed, and you're probably going to be closer than you were if you hadn't tried at all. But the problem with that is like, well, if you shoot for the top, the other narrative is you become so paralyzed with self-doubt that you don't fucking do anything. So if you aim for the bronze, then you might actually get somewhere. So maybe that could be my lesson from this podcast.
I was going to say, if you aim for the bronze, then there's confidence there. It's like, I'm going to win something.
Yeah, and what I felt like I could add to the sort of aesthetic of the Adamsian kind of space odyssey is I could get my gross American emotions all over it. I could say way too many things about feelings, as Eurovision songs tend to do, and use that kind of part of my culture where everything is overshared and straightforwardly far too sincere, to sort of contrast that, and that I might come up with something new out of that.
Well, I wonder, given that you had to create so many different alien species, which were some of your favorites? Maybe a top 3.
Sure, I love the Elikon. They're the little guys who live on the all black planet, which is a real exoplanet actually. I pulled some real planets that we've observed with our very powerful telescopes into it. So it's basically the surface of the planet is so black that it deflects light. So all of this whole species are super small and kind of creepy looking, and they're completely black from head to toe. They have big giant eyes to let in as much light as possible. And their whole society was built because every other society used their planet to dump all of their military secrets, bodies, anything they wanted to hide. They would just pitch it out the window into this planet. And so they kind of scavenged the culture out of that. So I love the Elecon. Actually, my car's license plate has the name of one of them on it. I like the Smaragdi. They're fun. They're like these 10-foot tall skeletal El Greco type looking aliens, but they they have a severe cultural taboo against positivity. So they are constantly putting themselves down, but once you sort of understand what they're doing, you can hear that they're actually really arrogant and bragging about themselves, but they're doing it by talking about what a terrible, non-sentient pile of crap they are, and have stand-up modesty open mic nights for members of their culture to do that professionally. And I guess I love the Eska, who's the one that's in it probably most. The Eska and the Keshet. So the Eska are the ones who contact us first. They are somewhere between a flamingo and an anglerfish, but bright blue, and their voices access kind of infrasounds, the resonant sounds that make you feel religious in church or afraid on a windy night. So they can kind of control people with their singing. But I love all my babies, all my alien babies. I made a lot of them. I think that they are all super cool. It was really important to me that they be wildly different, not just Star Trek aliens with a different sticker on their forehead, because I'm not limited by budget or anything like that. So, I kind of noted down a lot of different alien types that I wanted to write about. So there's kind of a predator type, like the movie Predator, and there's a AI and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, like I said those three, and now I'm like, how could I not have said the Yurtmac? How could I not have said the Keshet? But I do love all my babies.
Yeah, and in terms of kind of coming up with these species, I mean, did you kind of research a lot and just read up on various things until you were inspired? Or, I mean, what did that look like? I mean, as someone who's never had to create 20 plus alien species pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that was going to be a really difficult part of writing the book, that I would have to come up with, if not as many alien species as there are Eurovision countries, at least a reasonable facsimile of that number. So I knew I'd have to come up with at least 20 and probably more. So some of them come from like weird animals on Earth. So, the extremophile species, the Alunazar, are based on sea squirts, which is about the simplest life form you can come up with. And the Keshet are red pandas. That was just a joke. I just thought that would be funny because I think they're the cutest animal. So I just, neither red nor pandas. And so a lot of them come from just the weird stuff that you can see and find even on our planet with billions of species. And then some of them are like, I knew I wanted to have a disembodied AI species, because there's lots of AI in science fiction, but the fact that AI doesn't actually need a body in any way is something I don't see done very often. So that's the 321 are the AI species. And some of them are jokes. Like one of them's algae. I tried to like spread it among the sort of types of life that we even notice and have here. So we've got the algae ones, we've got ones that have flesh and are sort of mammalian, got reptilian ones, we've got, rock, essentially the Utarak. Every kind of sort of phylum kingdom is sort of evenly represented. And then I started looking up exoplanets, as I mentioned, and sort of reverse engineering from there, what kind of species do I think would evolve on this planet, and what sort of culture would they evolve from that? There's an element of solving puzzles about that. You've got kind of these parameters, and you work forwards or backwards from that. It's really quite a lot of fun. And then, like, I knew I was going to have a gamer species where you never actually see them. You only see their avatars. It was basically so I could make a douze point joke. It was a long way to go for that joke, but did get there. Yeah, so they just kind of come from observing the weirdest kind of life you can see right in front of you right now and putting that out in space, as well as little jokes at the expense of the body of science fiction literature.
Yeah, well, I think, it's a good idea to go to enormous lengths purely to make an in-joke or, things like that. I'm a fan of that, taking it far too far.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I wonder too, and even though I'm sort of linking this question to space opera, I could link it to most of your work, but how do you approach writing a book that is simultaneously a comedy, but also pretty bleak?
Yeah, I mean, for all the glitter of space opera, it is pretty bleak. But again, like I felt that's part of Eurovision too. That it started after the war as a genuine attempt to sort of unify the continent, and maybe less of the murder and more of the singing. And all through the history of the contest, we've seen judges give their points out while missiles are flying overhead. We've seen, during the Balkan crisis, Bosnia coming and singing this amazing song directly about it, even though you're not supposed to sing about politics. And all of that is kind of at the crunchy core of Eurovision. So I wanted to get at that. But on the other hand, that's just what you say on a book tour. The fact is, I wrote this book in January through March of 2017, which is when Trump was inaugurated. And I didn't feel like I could just write a happy book. I had to say something. Like, it was just when I say it was a bleak time, it's so much bleaker. It got so much bleaker, but it seemed like it was as bad as it was going to get then. And so if I was going to be able to write it all, I had to say something about all of that. So there's some discussion of fascism and the worst of humanity and everything else in the book. When the question is humanity a sentient race? And the answer is not an automatic yes, then these are the things that you ultimately have to examine. And I've been doing it, like you say, it can apply to a lot of my work, because from pretty much the jump, I've been putting comedic scenes in very serious dramatic works. I love doing that. It's a lot of fun. Deathless is another book of mine, and that's set during World War II, during the siege of Leningrad in Russia. And there's a number of very funny sequences about communism and Russian folklore. And I've been combining those things for a long time, and I think that there's a certain natural union of the grim and the giggles. Like it's gallows humor. It's the way that we find a kind of catharsis that lets us get through the grim and the bleak. So the difference with space opera is that its sort of primary genre was comedy and secondary genre was science fiction, rather than primary genre being science fiction and then it's got some funny in it. So it really made me take a different approach, and you have to kind of open up the dimension of what's funny, as well as what moves the plot, what illuminates character, what is pleasing to the ear, what's going to make people laugh is this whole other dimension to it. So it was really kind of a grueling writing process, honestly. I asked my husband to never let me say either of these two things were easy: being pregnant and writing space opera. They were not. I know that my memory will want to change it to those things being easy, but it really wasn't. It was one of the most challenging writing experiences of my career. But my favorite thing to do really is like go along like we're all having this happy, psychedelic, glittery good time, and then punch people right in the heart. That's kind of my whole gig. So yeah, I mean, there's very short chapters in space opera, which kind of helps. It means you can, once you've set up that rhythm and that pattern, you can kind of turn on a dime, and people accept it. But I think the best parts of the book are where even in the same sentence you have those things crossing paths, so that a sentence will start out, lighthearted and end very wistful or very stern, or starts out stern or wistful and ends up funny. So all of those contrasts are just really pleasurable things to write, and I think pleasurable to read too.
Yeah, and of course the short chapters also just wonderfully ties into the Eurovision contest in general. I mean, these short songs and then on to the next.
Yeah, well, and so many of my American readers, and I was well aware, and I think that this is part of why my publisher didn't expect it to be the success that it became. I was well aware I was trying to sell a Eurovision book to American readers who literally have never heard the word Eurovision in their lives. It went better than expected, and way more Americans know about Eurovision now than they did in 2018 when it came out. But one of the things that no American reader seems to get, the only people I ever hear from complaining about it are Americans who are like, I didn't understand why there are these little chapters about like the history of a particular planet in the music competition. Like, I didn't get why we needed that. And I'm like, it's literally this is how Eurovision is. Just watch Eurovision. They're called postcards. They have the little things before each song with all the favorite objects of the singer and everything. So even the structure of the book is based on the structure of the grand final. It is stapled to it at every point.
Yeah, well, we certainly appreciate you and then Will Ferrell in more recent years doing the work to spread the good word about Eurovision. Well, from planets to countries, you've lived in a number of countries, as you alluded to earlier. And so not only in your childhood were you going between Seattle and California, which I'm aware are the same country, just to put that out there. But then, you lived in the UK, in Edinburgh, you lived in Japan, you're now currently residing on Peaks Island. So, I mean, I wonder, what have you learned both from living in these different places and then specific lessons to some of those places?
Oh, I mean, I have from whether it's from my childhood or just inborn, I've always had the travel bug, wanderlust, and I lived all over the place, and in multiple countries, in just about every part of America. Sometimes, as when I lived in the American South, what I learned was I hate it here. I never want to live here again. And I wasn't a huge fan of living in the Midwest either, but I learned how much I love Four Seasons and being able to sort of track time that way. When you live on the West Coast, it's not the same, because so much it's evergreen in Seattle. You don't really ever see the leaves turn much, and they just don't even bother. They just drop off in one night in California, and then the winter is never really particularly cold. So I learned how much I really do better in those climates. God, I mean, I loved living in Edinburgh. I really did. It's such an extraordinary city. I think it's probably the only time in my life that I have lived in a place where it is just convenient to be on foot. I could walk to any of the cultural entertainment that I ever wanted, from CC Bloom's, which is the best gay club I'd ever seen, to very, very fancy theater during the festival. So it's probably the best. I'm not really a city girl, but I am an Edinburgh girl. I love that city to death, and that's probably the only city I would consent to live in. So sometimes what I learn is I love it here, and I wish I could live here forever. Um, Boy, Japan was just a series of lessons over and over and over, because of I was there because my first husband was a naval officer, but I didn't know anything about it. And the internet was still in its toddlerhood. So I was just totally lost, and none of the other Navy wives liked me because I was young and punky and I had a nose piercing, dyed hair. So they wouldn't help me figure anything out either. So, I mean, I guess I learned that I can figure anything out eventually. And I learned to be on my own in Japan. I think that's the most important thing I learned. My first husband was in the Iraq War. He was gone almost the whole time we were there. So it was just me and my dog. And I had to figure everything out by myself and sort out my own anxiety about taking trips on my own, because I didn't for the first year I was there. I didn't go anywhere because I was so anxious about it. But it was clear my husband wasn't coming back, and I wasn't going to waste the time I had in Japan. So, I started planning trips for myself, and I got over that anxiety of not having anyone else with me to help if something went wrong. I learned to be by myself, and that's really where my writing career started. It's not where I wrote my first book at all. In fact, I started my first book in Edinburgh, and I finished it in Rhode Island. But it was where I wrote The Orphan's Tales, or at least the first volume of it, and kind of where I learned a work ethic and how to work from home before everybody had to learn to work from home 17 years later. But how to do that. And again, I had no one to help me, and the internet was not half so full of advice as it is now on such specific things. There was no such thing as YouTube, children. It did not yet exist. So yeah, where I kind of became who I am as a worker, that all happened in Japan. You learn something different everywhere. Honestly, just a really good question. And in Maine, what I've learned is how to live in a village, how to not just be on my own all the time, how to rely on my neighbors and be a neighbor that someone can rely on, and how to make connections with people who are really different than me. Maine lobstermen were not people that I had really met before. And there's lots of different kinds of people on this island. I'm being a little facetious by saying lobstermen. There's actually not very many. But I've learned to live with a small group of humans I didn't pick or give birth to, or had given birth to me. That's been really something as well.
Yeah. How did it come to be that you lived on Peaks Island?
So we were talking about Stephen King and how I thought all the magic in America was on the East Coast. Well, he of course lives in Maine very famously, and I wanted to go to the place where magical things could happen when I was little, and I really liked blueberries a lot. So I kind of got fixated on Maine when I was a little kid. And I was also the kind of child who imagined where they were going to live when they grew up that wasn't where they were. And Maine is the furthest you can get from the West Coast on a map in America. So I always kind of had a fixation on it, and I didn't want to live in Cleveland anymore. So I can work anywhere. My husband was working from home, so we kind of drew up some parameters, the 4 seasons, snow, ocean, which it kind of lands you in New England, in America. So I was like, well, we could live in Maine. And so I pulled up Craigslist, and the most recent rental was a year-round rental on Peaks Island. And those don't come up very often. I feel like I didn't even realize then how much those don't come up. I don't even think anybody advertises year-round rentals on Craigslist anymore, because you can find people desperate to live here so fast. So we took it sight unseen. I was 29. Couldn't afford to both go check it out and move there. So I just moved to an island in the Atlantic Ocean I had never seen before. And I was 29 years old.
Yeah, well, it seems to be working out quite well for you.
Yep. And the majority of it's such a strange thing to think about now because it never felt like that until recently. But the majority of my career has taken place here. I moved here right before Palimpsest came out. So the Orphan's Tales had come out and the sort of short, small press novels had come out. I moved here in November. Palimpsest came out in February. So essentially, everything bar one book that has made me who I am as a writer, that has been successful enough to continue this life for me, that has defined, who I am as an artist to the world, has all happened on this island pretty much.
So there you go. I think the magic really does happen in Maine. That is the takeaway. So maybe now the demand for living in Maine has increased even more as people listen to this and they think, right, of all the writing and creative takeaways from this episode, clearly the main one is just move to Maine.
Michael, I've told that story a lot of times, and neither have I nor anyone else pointed out that, yeah, the magic did happen in Maine.
Yeah.
That all the times I've told that story.
I mean, it sounded like you gave quite a persuasive pitch to your husband in terms of moving there, but I mean, really, I think you should have just been able to say 2 points: blueberries, Stephen King. That's it. You should have said, right, no further questions. Let's do it.
What else do you need?
Person, to prepare for moving to Japan, I read a book of Japanese fairy tales. I just, my brain does not work along normal paths. But my ex-husband now, he's actually one who sealed it for me, because I kind of started to panic at the last minute, and he said, "Look, if we hate it, then we've got a year's worth of stories about that time we lived on an island in Maine, and that's better than having a year's worth of stories about living in some random suburb." So that sealed the deal for me. So he was on board all the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the good thing about being a writer or creative anyway, that when bad things happen, it's like, well, I mean, there could be some stories to tell, perhaps some hilarious anecdotes. I mean, sometimes with the woeful things that happen, it's a bit of a stretch to make them hilarious, but, I have confidence that if anyone can do it, it is you.
Thank you.
So I know as well that you've spoken about being an actress for years. So I think even before getting into writing. So when did you first get into acting?
Really early on. My grandfather owned an ad agency in Seattle, or ran one, and I was in a few commercials, and then I was in plays. I was in plays for a long time, and I some of them are high school and college and stuff. But the thing you have to understand about high school plays in Davis, California, is it was not like high school plays are in other places. At the time, that city had 5 fully funded theater companies in it, and it was a city of 50,000 people. It was right near the Bay Area. My drama teacher was also a professional actress, and going to shows right after school to perform. So the productions I was in were very serious productions. And there was also a whole theater company called Acme for kids 13 to 18 to do every part of a show, from directing to tech to all of that. So I was involved in everything I could be. And I had some paying stage work after that. And then really I got to a point where I was really enjoying it. And I had written some plays and directed and had them put on and everything. And I did really enjoy it. But I was in college and I felt like everybody else was a lot more, committed to trying to make it in Hollywood or New York or something. And I knew I didn't want to do it for a living. and so I shifted over to tech, and I did tech for another couple of years, and stage managing and stuff. And then I kind of just quit. Fortunately or unfortunately, it's still a huge passion of mine. And the fact is that I get to act all the time now. I've done my own audiobooks. I do readings all over the place. I act plenty. But it was certainly the passion of my life up until writing took over.
Yeah, and I guess linked into acting, you've also put on a number of musical performances and collaborations with S.J. Tucker.
Yes, I have. But the other sense in which theater has never left my life.
Mm.
Yeah, well, I mean, SJ is an extraordinary artist, and I was a huge fan of hers before we ever met. But we clicked the second that we did meet. We've been sisters since the day we met. And she's done 4 albums based on my books. We've toured for them, and with Palimpsest, we toured for 4 months across the country from Maine to LA, selling that book out of the back of her truck. So she's definitely one of my partners in life.
Yeah. How was it that the two of you met?
We met at a con.
Ah.
At LunaCon, which is quite a venerable old New York convention. And gosh, what year was that? I want to say that was 2005. I think it was 2005. Which means that we've known each other for 16 years, and that's just absurd. I can't even get my head around that. But yeah, I mean, we had our sons exactly 30 days to the minute apart. We are very in sync. That girl and I highly recommend everyone check out her work, because she's fantastic.
30 days to the minute.
To the minute.
I just wanted to clarify that this is literally not the literally that some people use to mean not literally, but actually literally.
September 20th, October 25th.
Damn. Wow. I mean, I wonder as well how it even goes from, you meet at a con, you strike up an amazing friendship simultaneously, but then it goes to, I'm going to make 4 albums based on your books. I mean, I'm sure that wasn't the exact thing that was said. I mean, it must have unwound more organically than that. But even to make 1 album based on your book.
Oh, I had given her, I think it was a galley of the Orphan's Tales, because I don't think it was out yet, of the first book. And we'd talked about albums based on books earlier in the evening. I'm not going to say that like it was a bolt out of nowhere, like that had come up. Albums based on books. And we talked about like Poe and House of Leaves and all this other stuff. And she was staying with us in Cleveland, and I remember so clearly, like it was yesterday and not 16 years ago, waking up in the morning, and she came flying out of the guest room, just face alight and holding her guitar and saying, I wrote you a song, listen. And it was the first song on the first Orphan's Tales album. And I think anyone listening, if you go listen to that first song, you can probably feel what I felt, because it's an amazing tune. It's a really, really good song. And it's kind of like, I don't know, it's like one of those moments in the movies where you turn the radio on and the radio is talking about you, Those things that never happen in real life. And we did a few shows together. Reading concerts is what we call them. We did a few shows together for the Orphan's Tales. Maybe a little more than a few, now that I'm thinking about it, because there were 2 books, and she did an album for each of them, and both of them had touring. And then we did quite long versions of it at conventions. Gosh, I seem to remember somewhere in the back of my head us like half turning it into a play at the request of one of the conventions, and being very uncertain about that, but doing it. And then Palimpsest was the big tour because the economy had crashed and my publisher had been reorganized back into Random House. So no one was marketing the book at all. So it was either do something big or let it fail. And it was only my third book with big New York presses. And like, if that one failed, it kind of might have all failed. So we did something drastic and we went on this huge tour. It was just, God, I don't even remember how many cities. We stopped in every city that we could get to. We took 40 fans on a train from Chicago to New Orleans and had a masked ball in New Orleans. We did our shows everywhere, from a beautiful hotel to a sports bar. Like we did everything. We picked up performers in every city that we passed through. So sometimes we had snake dancers, and sometimes we had aerial artists, and sometimes we had our wonderful cellist Betsy Tinney and the singer Vixie and Tony with us, and sometimes it was just SJ and I. But we were the circus, and we blew through town and then on.
Yeah, and the success of Palimpsest really paid off because, I mean, not only did you get a Hugo nomination, but you got a husband, and most Hugo nominations don't come with a husband, in fact. So I guess you were lucky in that sense.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, first of all, it completely blew me away that it was nominated. I didn't even have that on my radar as a possibility. Like, gosh, I was so young. I don't even think I'd turned 30 yet. And it was just like, I thought, oh, well, maybe in 20 years, if I'm really lucky, I'll get nominated for a Hugo. Like, it never occurred to me that was going to happen. I think I might have actually blacked out a little when the email came through. But it was in Australia. So there was no way I could afford to go. And that was fine. But it actually turned out that Expedia had screwed up this whole trip of mine. And so I had a voucher from them, an I'm sorry voucher. It had all these stipulations on it. So I could only use it all at once, and it had to be on one trip, and I could only spend it on me. I couldn't split it with anybody else. And it was pretty much the price of a round trip ticket to Melbourne and 2 weeks in a hotel. And I do remember it. I remember it very clearly, looking up during my reading and thinking, wow, there's a really cute boy in the front row. And that cute boy is the father of my child and my husband now. It's a very strange world out there.
Yeah.
But yeah. So we started talking in the bar, and I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, it's funny how these moments happen in life as well. You know that you couldn't possibly go to Australia, but then you get this voucher with such specific terms, and then you look at the value of it, you look at the round trip price, and here you are.
Yep. Yeah, it honestly, it's kind of terrifying to think about. I think about it when I look at my son sometimes. Like, do you know how easy it would be for you to have never come close to existing? Like,
Yeah.
it would have been so anything along this series of events, and it wouldn't have happened. But did.
Yeah, it's a strong thing to say to a child, but sometimes you've got to spit truth. So, I mean, you've said before, you've spoken very openly about having ADD. So I'm wondering, as a creative, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of being a creative with ADD?
Well, I mean, the advantage is hyperfocus. I mean, I'm sure that most people have heard this by this time, but ADD is incredibly poorly named. ADHD. It's not just an attention disorder that is a small part of it, and a lot of people don't even have the hyperactivity part. It's an executive disorder. So we can focus on things, but it's all or nothing. So it's either I am ride or die 100,000%, not eating, not drinking, just focused on this thing, or I can't finish a page reading about it to save my life. Like it's very all or nothing. Or at least it was when I was unmedicated. And but it is a big advantage to be able to pour that focus into a book. And I used to talk about my process, and I used to say that my whole work ethic is just outracing my terrible personality, because I didn't understand that what I meant by my terrible personality was that I have ADHD and no one's ever told me. Even though it's kind of crazy, because The Orphan's Tales is practically screaming out, I have undiagnosed ADHD. It is the ADHD novel. But yeah, so that's pretty much the advantage, that once that switch flips, there's nothing that could pull you away from it. It's switching that or flipping that switch at all that is difficult. And because I used to talk about writing books in 30 days, and I wrote Palimpsest in 30 days. I've written several of my books, but that was outrunning ADHD. I just didn't have medication. I didn't understand it at the time. And I still write books fast because it's much better for me to use that hyper focus to push through a draft as quickly as possible. And, we can fix it if it's not great when the hyper focus passes. But the disadvantages are just getting that switch flipped is virtually impossible without medication and a lot of tools. We're not terribly organized people most of the time, and I've always had real trouble with that. But that's why, again, the hyper focus. I pretty much keep my books in my head, because I never really learned how to take good notes. I just learned how to take good doodles. So I do some outlining and note taking, but most of it's just kept in my head. And that's a shaky proposition, but I don't really know any other way to do it. So it's a mess being a creative ADHD person, but there are a lot of things about it that end up with a pretty unique perspective. And if you can kind of just hold on to just enough tools by the skin of your teeth, then you can access that hyper focus and produce things. But I hear tell that there are people out there who don't have trouble with any of that. It seems unrelatable to me, but I've heard they exist.
Yeah, and I guess if you're keeping the majority of your book in your head, that's another reason why, it's advantageous to you to write these books quickly, because, you need to exercise it, as it were, to get that out of your head. And I mean, if you're not writing them in 30 days, but still pretty quickly, I'm wondering what would you say is the kind of time it takes you to write, I guess, a novel length work these days?
It absolutely depends on the book. And since I had my son, I'm not quite as fast as I used to be, because there's this whole other world building exercise that needs doing.
Yeah.
So, but like I wrote Fairyland in 8 weeks. That's a pretty good. That's quick, but it's a good representation of how long it takes me to put out a book. It's really that once I sit down, there's a lot of work that's already been done of planning it and imagining it and living with the characters, and just making plans to write takes a lot longer than the actual typing. So once I sit down, I have a lot of pre-work done. But yeah, between 2 and 3 months, once I actually start the actual physical typing, is usually about right.
Yeah, and how many projects do you normally have on the go at once? Is it common for you to be writing one book, but then also doing pre-work on another?
Oh, absolutely. That's very common. I'm a little backed up at the moment because I'm still catching up with my maternity leave work, that everything kind of just gets shifted forward quite drastically, even with a small delay in publishing. So I'm still kind of catching up with all of that. But yeah, it's just deceptive. It's deceptive. And then there's the editing process on top of that. But the first flush of writing, really like 2 or 3 months, that's my ideal time span. And I'm working, like right now I'm working on the sequel to Space Opera. I'm working on a big project I can't tell anybody about. And that's kind of it for the next 2.5 months as I finish the book. But if I wasn't actively like in that 2 to 3 month window of physically typing a novel right now, I would also be doing short stories, and I would probably have an article or an essay I was writing. I have my Patreon that I do every content for every month. And then on top of that, I might be doing some freelance work for some other company I can't talk about. There's a lot of can't talk about things in writing, but yeah, I'm usually working on multiple things at once.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing it seems you can talk about, at least to a point, is the sequel to Space Opera. Am I right in thinking it's titled Space Oddity?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
What can you tell us about Space Oddity?
Yeah, so it basically picks up where the previous one left off, and it concerns the discovery of the next borderline sentient species and needing to make decisions. The same decision that was made for Earth for them. And of course, Decibel Jones is the one who discovers that species. So it's a little different, but we will still have our song contest in it. And it's certainly different because what happened between selling this book, the sequel, and writing it is that Eurovision was canceled for the first time. So it also involves that.
Wow. Well, I am very much looking forward to it. And I mean, you said before that there was some pressure, in a sense, in knowing that there would be comparisons to Douglas Adams. So, why not up the ante by calling it Space Oddity? Why not add a little bit more?
Look, I mean, there's so many references to Bowie in the first book. It might as well be called that too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I figured I would be forgiven that. It's just such a good pairing with space opera, and it fits the story so well. But yeah, I mean, my protagonist's surname is Jones. His first name starts with D. The whole thing is a Bowie love letter. It's just a little more low key than the Eurovision love letter.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to the first part of the conversation with Catherine M. Valente. Join us again next time for the second and final part. But if you'd like to get that ahead of the crowd, if you'd like to get every episode ahead of the crowd, then become our patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. And not only do you get early bird access to every episode, but you can submit questions to each and every guest, and you get a number of bonus podcasts, including the Patreon's only Q&A sessions, the videocast on camera off record, and Story Unboxed, the horror podcast on the craft of writing. There's also a wonderful writers forum over on Discord. So head over to patreon.com/thisishorror and see if it's a good fit for you. Okay, before I wrap up, a little bit of an advert break.
From the host of This Is Horror podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. Their watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
Being an independent publisher, we are just like you. We share the same passion, the same love for horror fiction. We believe in the incredible work being created, unnoticed by the mainstream. And we want to share it with the world. We are the Sinister Horror Company.
As always, I would like to end with a quote, and this is from Alan Watts. "This is the real secret of life, to be completely engaged with what you are doing in the here and now, and instead of calling it work, realize it's play." I'll see you in the next episode for the second part of the conversation with Catherine M. Valente. But until then, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.